All right, welcome back to the Nexus podcast. We are recording live at RSA conference in San Francisco. Ahmik Hindman is my guest. Ahmik is a senior network and solution consultant at Rockwell Automation. 28 years experience in the OT, ICS, and automation and cybersecurity fields. He is speaking this week during the conference on patching OT, and that's definitely what I want to pick his brain about. So how you doing? Thank you for coming on.
Great. Pleasure.
So tell me a little bit about 28 years at the same company. That's kind of an amazing thing.
Yeah, it's been a good ride. You know, I've got a lot of exposure. You know, my primary expertise is around industrial control systems. So, majority of that time was focused on helping our customers, you know, look at their network design, look at their controls. How do we upgrade? What's the difference between all these different products? And as you can imagine, over that 28 years,
sure,
technology has changed. But I love learning, so it's, you know, I like to learn new things and dig in deep, and then be able to educate and help other customers with that. So,
is that kind of your day to day, just on the customer end?
Yeah. So customer facing, I look and, you know, holistically what we can do to secure our systems for our customers, and then help kind of direct and choose the best solution. You know, is it a combination of role-based access control with our FactoryTalk security in combination with, you know, network segmentation, and, you know, maybe that's some work for our cybersecurity team to come in and do a network design if the customer doesn't have that capability, or, you know, or looking at a OT IDS, you know, like Clarity to put in place, or, you know, it just, so looking kind of holistically what we can do to help secure those systems, and some, you know, a lot of education around that space.
Yeah, I'm sure. So I'm always curious, like, who do you talk to? Are you like the so-called hard hats, or engineers?
It's a mix. I think when customers, obviously we'll be reactive to specific questions that come out.
Sure.
Other times we're a little better positioned to understand with, you know, if we've got a dedicated salesperson covering that account, understanding what the kind of the needs of the OT and IT are. And some of our best meetings as far as getting adoption have been when we have both in the same room. Right? And have a cybersecurity workshop and work through, you know, the IT's priorities, and work through the OT's priorities, and make sure we understand, you know, what's unique about each, how we can leverage tools from both sides, how we deploy the right tools in the right location. You know, that's all. Those have been very effective meetings.
Is OT still kind of culturally like, that's not me, I don't want to hear about cyber, that's not?
I would. It's hit or miss depending on the company. I think customers, you know, like safety. Early on, I mean, Rockwell was promoting safety. Hey, we got to integrate safety into our systems, and there was pushback until, you know, maybe 4 or 5 years after we started talking to customers. You know, you saw you know, some increased regulation. Sometimes that was litigation with, you know, someone supplying a not, quote, non-safe system in the U.S. but shipping something overseas. And so I think it's analogous to that kind of scenario with the security side, where, you know, even as Rockwell's a manufacturer, we have this, you know, DFS design for security function. I think several other customers are looking at that. How do we secure those systems?
Sure.
Some of it's driven by regulation too, like, so we see with insurance, either regulation and or insurance requirements.
Really?
Yeah. So cybersecurity insurance, and say, hey, show me your disaster recovery plan. What are you doing? What's your change management plan? Do you have authentication, role-based access to your controllers?
Right.
You know, what does your network look like? They're getting smarter about that, because ransomware is you know, manufacturing saw, you know, 50% increase in ransomware.
So is that like a baseline to determine coverage? You have to have X, Y, and Z, or?
Well, there's certain checklists that I mean, depending on, we've seen it from, if we're talking about insurance, they have like a checklist they're going down, saying, qualify.
That's what I meant. Insurance.
And you know, certainly from the we look at aligning with the standard. There's guidelines and recommendations. You know, guidelines like NIST 800-82, you know, R3 or the 62443 series of standards. You know, there's all kinds of, here's how you should go through a formal risk assessment process and so forth.
So as I mentioned in the introduction, you're doing a talk this week on patching OT. That's never a straightforward discussion. So we're going to publish this after your talk, but you know, just maybe you can share some of the kind of the themes you're going to go through, or what do you anticipate maybe in terms of questions from the audience?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to. I cover a variety of different things around tailoring, looking first of all, understanding what's out there, and I say you got to start with an updated inventory with visibility. If you're gonna have any chance of staying on top of that, and effectively, understanding the risk at your organization. One, it's like with OT/IDS, we can certainly look at data flow,
sure,
right, and understand what's communicating with what. I talk about that as a risk to manufacturing because oftentimes they don't know what systems. It's not very well documented on data flow. It's easy to create a message from one controller to the next, and if I start to secure that system and or update that one system, I might affect the other system. So I talk about some of that. I talk about interoperability. Some systems we just can't patch. You talk about 24/7, 365 operations, limited downtime window. But a lot of it's around helping kind of understand various techniques around prioritization. So looking at the common vulnerability scoring system, looking at tailoring that. So not just accepting the CVSS,
sure,
the vulnerability score of 8 and above, and hey, we're going to go patch that. We need to take a look and dig into that and see what that looks like.
Right.
I talk about some of the tools, like Clarity with looking at that, some of the risk evaluation and prioritization. What happens if we deploy an ACL in front of this?
Yeah.
Right. And then there's other opens. I talk about CVSS 3.1. I talk about CVS 4.0, the newest, classification. Both CISA is reporting both. Manufacturers like Rockwell are reporting both of those. I get into looking at stakeholder-specific vulnerability classification, and that's a CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency method for prioritization. And then talk also about legacy assets. So, if we've got an asset that is no longer manufactured by the customer, or no longer manufactured by the company,
sure,
and that also has a vulnerability, and that's on my a crown jewels critical piece of my equipment, and it's actively being exploited. It's like, okay, they're stacking up. I got to go address that vulnerability. Yeah. And then I talk about change management. We talk about mitigating controls. So make sure we have a backup of those programs. Also looking at compliance requirements. So just kind of wrap in a bunch of items in a 45-minute window. It'll be tight. And
it all matters, though.
Yeah, and I don't even get a chance to get into formal risk assessment process, right?
Right.
But just trying to emphasize the need to leverage tools out there to be able to automate some of this, right? Because there's no way someone's going to keep up to date on all this, right?
So I imagine if you gave this talk 10 years ago, it's a lot different than today. I mean, are you anticipating an IT audience?
Last year's session was packed, so I'm hoping for a similar. Last year we talked about our topic was U2 can secure OT, and kind of a play on words with
sure,
TOO, and that session was packed. So we had a mix of people. The people on the IT side looking at understanding OT and what's unique about that.
Right.
I talk about one of the stories I talk about is because we see sometimes IT managed and responsible for OT compute assets, so they want to understand a little better.
Yeah.
One of the examples I gave is an IT deploying a patch where they actually bring down the distributed HMI in the facility because they didn't look at what Rockwell is tested against, or what in this case I talk about open manufacturers. But had they have just looked and say, "Oh, Rockwell knows there's an issue with this IS patch, don't deploy it,"
right,
they would have saved a day of downtime.
Sure.
So yeah, it's going to be a mixed audience in there.
Is there a typical OT patching process? I'm sure you've seen a lot of different approaches. I mean, there can't be a catch-all, but I mean,
well, I think the approach is different. Usually it's going to be, although some people have tried to do it remotely. We're talking about, most people, do that adjacent to the machine or close to the process.
Sure.
So they can, quickly go back to the previous state. So it's a little challenging when it comes to, we talk about industrial control system devices and patching. because I might have a vulnerability on an Ethernet module or a processor. That's a little harder in some cases to patch than it is a Windows environment. Or deploying on the Rockwell side, we have something called a patch rollup, right? So it's pretty easy to download this patch rollup and actually click deploy. We've got a no-charge utility called Factory Talk Updater that goes out and pushes that update to all those different agents, and I could schedule the reboot. So that's pretty easy. I still need to look at interoperability, but when it comes to the firmware side, that's where it comes a little more challenging. So is there a process? That's something that I'm, out of my talk, I'm saying you need to develop a process. You develop a plan and process and a decision tree as far as when we're going to address this, how we're going to address out-of-band issues, right? If I have a high patch that I cannot wait for, my scheduled process to patch that, I need to make sure that that's documented.
Yeah.
So I would say it's really kind of ad hoc depending on the facility. And that's one of the things that I talk about. Leveraging a standard like 62443, I think it's 2-3 is the for the patch management, or is it 2.4? It's either one of those.
The firmware point that you made a few minutes ago is the challenge there an interoperability question or downtime?
Yeah, a combination of both. Downtime, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Interoperability and just making sure we look at all the different changes and as far as the impacts.
Yeah.
If I change this firmware on this I/O module, well, now I'm going to have to go back. It depends on how the program is set up. And where I might have, hey, this is a compatible keying, or I've got exact keying. If I've got exact keying enabled and I change the minor version on that, then I'm going to have to go back and touch that program, which means downloading to that program, taking that system offline.
Makes sense, yeah.
If I have a redundant processor configuration, and we've got a procedure for managing, flashing one, updating one while the other one's in operation. So you could do some of that without impacting, as long as I'm just kind of focusing on the processor side. So it's a bit of mix of both.
Sure. And how has convergence impacted this? Is that a cultural question more than technical?
I think it's definitely happening. We see the digitalization of the manufacturing, whether it's Industry 4.0 or some people, 5.0.
Yeah.
We see edge deployments, all over the place. Rockwell has solutions. We have SaaS offerings. We're continuing to build those out. And I think, that combination is, and the need to get access and make decisions is, that's also exacerbating the problem that we have with unsecured assets in that OT space. And especially if someone starts to connect those, they don't have a secure, they're not monitoring that network. They don't have an IDMZ segmentation, clear policies and procedures, and restricting that data flow. Then they're opening themselves up for, ransomware.
Sure.
Because typically that's what we see. The attacks on control systems is ransomware is the biggest thing. Now there's nation state attacks and other ones that then I don't talk about this, but I say you can't really regulate stupid, and so someone putting a PLC directly on the internet.
Yeah.
And we see those out there as well.
Yeah.
And default passwords, but.
Anyway, direct connectivity is just one of those no-nos.
Yeah.
It seems impossible. It still happens. But.
However, from a menu, Rockwell makes methods to do this kind of direct connectivity.
Yeah.
Others do as well, because for like OEMs, and OEMs like that. Hey, let me give you remote connectivity. I'll authenticate to the cloud, and then with a 443 outbound connection, I'll be able to connect to that asset. If I'm not monitoring that network, therein lies a vulnerability, right? I'm allowing someone direct VPN access, and I like the term, virus propagation network into my control system, right? And if I'm not monitoring that, then
it's trouble.
It's trouble. I'm putting a lot of trust in that person that's connecting.
Yeah. What's the breakdown you're seeing of IT people that now have OT responsibilities? How's that growing or changing?
I think so. I met a gentleman on the speakers event, and he was responsible for working with a Canadian airline and coming from the IT side, focused on the OT side.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes I see that those people being very effective if they get enough training on the OT side, because they really understand the networking side. And that I see has probably been one of the bigger challenges with maybe the traditional engineer, is not having that enough networking experience. And as we start to leverage IT-based, I mean, you look at Ethernet, we've gone from proprietary networks to everything basically on TCP/IP. But advanced networking connectivity, that's where I think the IT, influence and understanding helps. And as long as we do education with those people and say, here's the differences. We do things really fast.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of data. We need to have everything synchronized and make sure our time, leverage a common time source, like, leveraging, IEEE 1588 for time synchronization, and how that's better than NTP. And here's the testing and validated architectures that we go through. As long as we present that, then, those people are really, have been effective.
Do you see competing interests in those relationships, like uptime versus I want to patch everything, kind of from the IT side?
Competing in some cases, yes. I think when you get to like remote access type solutions, that can be a challenge. Although like the Clarity SRA is a fantastic way to enforce. I always talk about that as the one of the best ways to enforce an IDMZ. Right, and that concept and the simplicity of that from even an engineer to be able to use some of that stuff. The GUI is pretty straightforward, but yeah, there's always going to be conflicts on priorities. But hopefully if that collaboration helps us get through some of those, right? And we can understand and say, okay, we're going to compromise on this, right? I know this is your priority, but availability is key in the manufacturing space, right?
It may not be in scope for what you do, but I mean, are you seeing anything that's working in terms of collaboration, like some cool examples or ideas that were?
Well, just probably the best kind of collaboration examples, those cybersecurity workshops. Those have been really kind of effective. Making sure when we have, I do a lot of cybersecurity seminars, and we'll go out and in combination with like the FBI or CISA. And we always market those as, hey, talk to the engineer and ask the engineer to bring their IT brethren, and so they can understand, and so they can start this conversation between them, because there's a lot of things that IT does well that we need to utilize and leverage, right? And I always say use the tool that makes sense for the application. Use an OT IDS tool. Like Clarity CTD or XDOM at the OT layer, share that with the security information management system, whatever IT's using, so they can, now get something that makes sense.
Yeah. Makes sense, yeah. All of this convergence and connectivity of everything, how is it impacting vulnerability management in a sense? I guess, is it still work like traditional approaches?
Yeah, I think so there's a lot of customers that don't have a vulnerability management system, and that's one of the key things that I'm hoping is, and one of the things I harp on it, but I talk about in my talk is about looking at leveraging a tool to do that, right? Yeah. To do that initial inventory, to do that initial vulnerability classification. Those that aren't doing that today, it's just an ad hoc approach. I've seen where a plant manager says, hey, they've signed up for the CISA alerts, so those come out every day, right? Hey, here's a new automation, vulnerability, and that gets sent off down to sometimes the engineering manager. Do we have this vulnerability? Then they're tasked with finding. Oh, I think we do, and kind of that ad hoc approach. That's what, unfortunately, what I see still happening.
Sounds very manual.
Very manual, and that's why there's no way that people are keeping on top of that, right? Because one, they don't have an understanding of what's out there, and one of the things I talk about in my patch management talk is you got to have the visibility to down to the model number, the series, the rev level, because there's differences in vulnerabilities between a Series A and a Series B sometimes, or between version 2.1 and 2.5.
Sure.
Right? Where it's mitigated on one and not on the other.
Yeah. I mean, and you kind of hinted at it earlier, like it's almost a trap to kind of prioritize just by the CVSS score, for example.
Right.
I mean, there's other factors that you have to consider, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's so I'd like to get people to start there.
Sure.
At least start there, but yeah, look at other factors tailoring to their specific application. So prime example, and you can see this in the tools, it'll tell you what is the threat vector. If I know that it's a network based and I know that my system and it changes that processor, could make it some type of online change. By having the processor in run mode, if I validate that, in my case, maybe my policy for my facility is those processors are always in run mode, well, then I don't have a vulnerability, right? It's not applicable to me, unless I'm in the remote run mode.
Sure.
So that's where some of the tailoring, looking at, or maybe it's other mitigating controls. Maybe I have a next generation firewall in front of that device, and I'm only allowing, specific port from this specific. HMI or something.
Right. I mean, it feels like you're in line to miss a lot of stuff if you're looking just for a 9.0 vulnerability. But if you get a 6, but it's connected directly to the internet, like it's still an wide open door.
Right. Yeah, and that's where some of the tailoring helps. But even that, some of it's just going to be based. You can't just. I mean that you can't just go on that. You can't. You really have to understand the application. So this is where I tell people, hey, we're going to do our best guess initial classification. We'll identify that asset as a PLC, so it's immediately got a high impact. But its actual impact is going to be depending on how that's used in the facility.
Sure.
Right. So I say you have to tailor them. Look at the scoring, the risk score, what matches your application, and the controls that you have around that application. Otherwise, you're right. You're going to be hit and miss. You're going to patch something that really doesn't need to be patched and miss something else.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you wouldn't have time in your talk to kind of get through to some of the risk management stuff that you like to talk about. Give me kind of a sample of what you would like to include.
So if we look at IEC 62443, which is really that best kind of series of standards around addressing everything from the manufacturer, like just 4.1 and 4.2 is a security development lifecycle and a product security. That there you go through a classification and say, by the manufacturer, we know that we can achieve an SL1 or an SL2. Those are the two typical ones that we see. The escalation goes to SL4, which is a nation-state type attack.
Right.
And each, as you go up progressively in levels, you're going to get different controls around those and different. Talk about the 7 functional controls. Restricted of data flow. There's timely response to events.
Yeah.
And so they're saying, if I have an SL2, for example. If I classify and go through a formal risk assessment of that process and I classify it as an SL2, well, I now have to have MFA, for example, with that device, where SL1 doesn't.
Right.
And so to effectively mitigate vulnerabilities around that, and that might not be a CVE, but to protect that based upon the risk.
Sure.
I should go through a formal risk assessment process, and where they're factoring in all this stuff. I'm factoring longevity, life cycle status. I'm looking at vulnerabilities that are associated with that.
Yeah.
And it's a very detailed process to go through if you're doing it right, to go through the entire facility and classify all those assets, define zones, which are the different areas,
right.
Define conduits, the communication between those, and then restricting data flow between my different zones.
Yeah.
And then now implement. So that's one thing, classification of that. Now how do I go through and implement it, right? And especially if I have a legacy facility out there that doesn't have updated managed switches or all on one big subnet, well, now I got to look at, other ways to to do that. And depending on the life cycle of the industrial control system, we might be able to mitigate some of that with SIP security, which is no charge functionality of Rockwell, right?
Right.
And deploy basically via software that concept of zones and conduits.
It's interesting that you mentioned that very little stuff escalates to that SL4 nation state level, because 0 days always seem to get all the headlines and all the sexy talk, but it's the commodity stuff that burns you. It's like you're not in that threat model of very few people are in that threat model.
I would be very happy if people just develop a patch management plan for their compute assets and put some endpoint protection on there. That would solve a lot of, almost all of that, and protect, do some segmentation around OT and IT, and monitor. You start to layer these controls. That would address the majority of vulnerabilities out there, right?
Before I let you go, I wanted to hear more about the stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization, the classification there, and maybe something that listeners aren't super familiar with. Maybe you just kind of
so it's a decision tree process where you're looking at the exploitation status, and is that attack automatable? What's the impact to mission and well-being? And the outcome is this track star, which is a strange name. Attend and act. So as you go up in the scale, act is immediate,
severity,
and so it's just another way to help kind of classify. So if you look at when Rockwell releases our vulnerabilities, we talk about one. We give you the CVSS 3.1 vector, we give you the 4.0 vector, so you can then take those, paste them into a utility, and start to tailor those.
Sure.
And then we also say, hey, you should use some other form of classification, and here's a good one by CISA,
right?
Which is the stakeholder-specific vulnerability classification.
Yep.
And so I haven't looked to see. I'm sure there's tools that are starting to incorporate that and automate that. What I show in the patch management talk is just a little utility they have, which you can go through and kind of select and do that yourself.
Did these frameworks like that, do they allow for any kind of subjective inputs, or is
it's
binary?
I would say it's almost entirely, not entirely subjective, but some of it's, especially when you go to mission and well-being and impact, you're trying to, okay, is it partial or total?
Yeah.
And what are the categories? If it's, some of it's binary, especially if you've got the data with, is it automatable? That's going to be a yes or no.
Yes or no, right?
Right. But there's always a bit of subjectivity to any classification. Like even with the tailoring, right? Mm-hmm. You talk to, be interesting to a comparison to within the same company. Say, okay, tailor this. Here's your vulnerability. Use the CVSS version 4 calculator, and I show this off in my talk.
Right.
And without talking to the other person, you go through and reclassify this and tell me what the number you get at the end, and I bet you it's different.
It's different, right?
Yeah,
right.
So
really cool.
Anyway,
all right, man. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah,
this
my
is a
pleasure.
great conversation. Appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise.
Alrighty.